My name is Dale Fisher. I am 44 years old, and I have been a pipe welder for 21 years, working mostly on industrial jobs across Middle Tennessee. I grew up in Smithville. I still live in Smithville, and I have hunted white-tailed deer in Smith County and the surrounding hollow country since I was old enough to carry a rifle without dragging the barrel. I say all of this up front because I want you to understand who I am before I tell you what I saw. And I want you to understand that I have thought carefully about whether to say any of it out loud. The men I grew up around did not talk about things they could not explain. They worked, they hunted, they sat quiet at the end of the day. I am that kind of man. I am not given to stories. What happened in November of 2017 in the hollow country south of Carthage along the Caney Fork drainage is not a story I have told many times. I told my wife Peg the morning I got home, and I told it flat, without color, the way you'd read a service report. She listened, and she did not say I was wrong, and she did not ask follow-up questions. And I think she understood that what I needed was to have said it once to someone who knew me. After that, I carried it the way you carry a weight you have stopped noticing, only because you've learned to walk with it. I am going to tell you now because I think there are people out there who have been in the same woods in the same kind of dark, and they deserve to hear it from someone who does not have a reason to lie. Roy Hensley was 58 that fall. He is a big man, broad in the shoulders, gray in his beard, with the kind of patience that comes from 20 years of running trap lines in weather that would drive a younger man inside. Roy and I had hunted together since around 2004, and in all that time, I had seen him uncertain exactly once, and that was when a cornered copperhead came up onto the tailgate faster than either of us expected. Roy was not a man who got rattled. I want you to hold on to that. We drove out of Smithville early on the first Friday of rifle season in November 2017. I had a lease on about 40 acres of hardwood hollow ground, timber company property, accessed off a gravel county road that ran south from the highway between Carthage and Gordonsville. The hollow itself dropped away from the road on the east side, a steep-walled creek bottom with a half-mile of white oak flat at the bottom and a creek running through it, a small unnamed tributary that fed south toward the main stem of the Caney Fork. I had hunted that ground for 3 seasons. I knew the deer sign, I knew the crossings, I knew where the does bedded and where the big bucks pushed through during the rut in early November. That particular week was the first week of the rut, which was why we had picked it. The conditions were about as good as they get in Middle Tennessee. Temperatures in the upper 30s in the mornings, light south wind, mostly clear skies. Roy had brought his walker hound, Cutter. Cutter was 7 years old, a heavy-chested brindle dog with a long, soft face and a voice that carried across 3 ridges when he opened up on a track. Roy had been hunting behind that dog for most of Cutter's life. He kept him kenneled in the bed of his truck during the drive, and by the time we turned off the highway onto the gravel road, the dog was up and moving around the kennel the way he always did when he smelled that kind of country. We got to the pull-off at the lease gate around 4 in the morning. The plan was to run Cutter loose in the creek bottom the next day on Squirrel, stretch him out after the long drive. But that night we were just setting up camp, running the heater in the truck cab for a while, eating cold biscuits Roy's wife had packed. Ordinary. The whole first morning was ordinary. I went into my stand at first light and sat until 10. The rut activity was exactly what I had hoped for. 3 does filtered through the white oak flat in the first hour, A 4-point followed at a trot about 40 minutes after. And at 8:30, I watched a heavy-bodied 8-pointer work a scrape at the base of a tulip poplar about 90 yards out. I did not shoot him. I had already filled one tag the week before on a different property, and this trip was about giving Roy a clean shot at something respectable. I glassed him for a long time, watched the way he carried his head, watched him rake the poplar, watched him move off up the ridge at a walk, his rack catching what light there was. I came down at 10, walked back to camp, and Roy was up with coffee, going on the camp stove, in a good mood, talking about the sign he had seen along the lower crossing. We ate. We sat in the truck with the windows cracked, and by afternoon we had decided on stand positions for the evening sit. The whole day felt settled and right. The hollow was doing what I had always known it to do, and I had no reason to think about anything except wind direction and shooting lanes. That is when Roy opened the kennel door to let Cutter out before the evening sit. The dog came halfway out of the kennel and stopped. Roy had the door open all the way and was standing back to give him room, and Cutter just sat there at the kennel door with his feet on the tailgate looking south toward the tree line. Roy patted his leg and made the sound he always made to call the dog down. Cutter did not move. His hackles were up along his spine in a low ridge of stiff hair, and his head was low, not raised for air scenting the way a dog does when he picks up deer, but low and pushed forward the way a dog holds his head when he is not sure whether to run or stay. Roy said, "What's got into you?" It was a flat statement, not a question. He looked at me and I looked at the dog, and neither of us said anything else. Roy tried once more to coax the dog down, and Cutter backed up into the kennel and turned around and lay down. I have seen that dog go into thick cedar brakes in the dark after a wounded deer without hesitating. I have seen him wade chest deep across a flooded creek in January on a track. He was not a nervous dog. I told myself the dog had maybe winded a coyote somewhere down in the bottom, and that was all it was. Roy locked the kennel and we went to our stands without him. The evening sit was quiet, in a way I should have paid more attention to at the time. I sat for 3 hours in the white oak flat, and in that whole time I heard no squirrels working the mast. That was unusual for November in a flat like that. There were acorns on the ground thick enough to walk on, and normally by mid-afternoon the squirrels in that timber would be moving steadily, the sound of the acorn caps cracking and the chatter of them scrabbling up and down the bark, a constant low-level background. That evening there was nothing. The flat was quieter than it should have been, and the quietness had a particular quality to it, a pressed-down feeling like the air before a hard storm, though the sky was clear. I came down without seeing a deer and walked back to camp in the last gray light and told myself the rut activity had the deer keyed up and moving at odd times, and that was why the squirrels were scattered. Roy had a fire going when I got in. We ate. We talked a little about where to sit the next morning, and by 9 o'clock, we were both in our sleeping bags in the back of Roy's extended cab truck. I fell asleep without trouble. I woke up at something past midnight. I do not know the exact time. I woke because I had heard something, and when I came fully awake, I understood what it was. A slow, heavy impact against a tree trunk, somewhere down in the hollow. A single knock, then a pause of maybe 10 seconds, then 2 knocks in succession, a short double rap. I had heard wood knocking before in that hollow and in other ones. I had heard it enough times to know that hunters do it, and that some researchers claim animals do it, and that it is one of those sounds that gets attached to a lot of different explanations, depending on who you ask. I was not alarmed. I lay there and listened. The sequence ran for about 6 minutes. 1 knock, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock. The intervals were not identical, but they were close enough to suggest a pattern, rather than a falling limb or a tree rubbing in the wind. On a still night in a timber hollow, you learn to distinguish those things. I listened, and I thought about what could make that sound. And I landed on Hunter, same as I always did. Somebody on an adjacent tract making noise for whatever reason. Then the knocking stopped. Not the way a sound fades when the source moves away, or the way it trails off when whatever is making it decides to quit. It stopped mid-sequence. There had been 2 knocks, a pause, and the single knock that should have followed never came. The hollow just went quiet. And when it went quiet, it went completely quiet, the way the hollow almost never does. Because even at midnight in November, there are sounds. There are owls. There are small animals in the leaves. There is the creek moving. I lay in the truck listening, and the silence went on, and after a while I heard Roy shift in his sleeping bag, and I knew he was awake too. Neither of us spoke. After maybe 10 minutes, the creek sound came back, and a screech owl started up somewhere on the ridge above us, and the night returned to something like normal. I told myself whatever it had been had moved off. I did not sleep well for the rest of that night. Pre-dawn the next morning, I was down at the lower creek crossing before first light, finding my way in with a headlamp on the lowest setting, picking my way along the bank to get to my stand position without disturbing the flat above me. The creek at that crossing ran over a wide shelf of flat limestone with a narrow band of soft mud on the far bank where the water slowed in an outside bend. I had crossed that same mud bar a dozen times over 3 seasons, and I knew what tracks I expected to find there: raccoon, possum, deer, the occasional coyote. Deer. When I put my headlamp on the mud that morning, I found one track that I could not place with those categories. It was in the soft mud about 4 feet past the water's edge. The impression showed 4 long toes with what looked like strong curved nails set around a wide central pad. The stride associated with it, based on where the mud was disturbed both before and after, was long enough that I stood beside it and measured it against my own stride. And the step was longer than mine by a considerable margin. I am 5 feet 10 inches tall, and I have a normal walking gait. Whatever had made that track was moving with a stride that did not match any animal I had a ready name for in that hollow. I stood there with the headlamp on it, and I went through my list. Black bear came first, because bear tracks in soft mud will sometimes distort and spread in ways that confuse the proportions, and there are bears in the Caney Fork country. They push up from the river bottom in the fall following the mast crop. The problem was the toe arrangement. A bear's front and rear prints look very different from each other, and what I was looking at was consistent in shape across both impressions I could see, and it did not match either the front or rear print of a bear in any way I recognized. I pulled up my memory of every bear track I had ever looked at and held it against what was in front of me, and the comparison was poor. I tried coyote next, then dog, then bobcat. The size eliminated all 3. The stride eliminated them again. I crouched down in the mud beside that track for a long time, moving my headlamp across the impressions from different angles. and the longer I looked at it, the less it resembled anything I had a word for. I finally straightened up, looked both directions along the creek bank, found nothing else, and walked to my stand. You tell yourself things in those moments. You tell yourself you are misreading the light. You tell yourself the mud distorted it. You tell yourself there is always an explanation you have not thought of yet, and that you are the kind of person who finds explanations, because you have always been that kind of person. I told myself all of those things. I climbed into my stand and waited for the light to come. The light came gray and slow, the way it does in a hollow, arriving late because the ridges hold back the sky, and when it was light enough to hear what should have been happening, I noticed the crows were not there. In November, in white oak timber with a massed crop on the ground, crows come in every morning. They work the flat. They hop along the creek bar. They call back and forth to each other from the oak crowns. On the 2 previous mornings I'd heard them. On this morning there were none. I sat and waited, and the light increased, and the flat below me stayed silent in a way that pressed on my chest. The silence was not the absence of one particular thing. It was the absence of all of it. The crows, the squirrels, the chickadees that would normally be working the bare branches by this hour, the woodpeckers. The hollow was holding its breath. If you have spent enough time in the woods to know what they sound like when everything is right, you also know what they sound like when something is wrong. I have heard the silence that follows a coyote moving through a deer herd. I have heard the silence after a hawk takes a bird off a low branch. Those silences have a shape to them, and they end inside of a few minutes. This silence had a different shape. It went on past the point where any natural disturbance would have run its course. I sat in the stand and I did not move, and my 30-06 lay across my lap with the safety on. At around 8 in the morning, I glassed the far ridge, which ran roughly parallel to the hollow about 80 yards from my position, along an east-facing slope of mixed hardwood. I was looking for deer movement along the bench that ran below the ridge line. I was not looking for anything else. What I saw come through the timber between 2 oaks on that bench stopped the glass in my hands. It was upright. It was moving slowly, left to right across the bench, in and out of the timber in a way that made it hard to hold continuously in the glass. The first thing I registered was the height, because I had a reference. The 2 oaks it moved between were trees I knew from below, trees I had walked past, trees I had estimated at about 50 feet, with trunks at chest height that were roughly 18 inches across. The thing moving between them came up to a point on those trunks that was, by my estimate, higher than the top of my head. Moving upright, moving in a smooth, rolling gait that was not the gait of any man I had ever watched walk through timber. A man walks with his weight shifting side to side through his hips. This moved with its weight carried forward, the whole body inclined slightly, the arms swinging in long, low arcs. The color was dark, a dense, dark brown or dark gray, and the light on the bench was poor enough that I could not separate individual features at 80 yards. No antlers, no orange. The movement continued for about 5 seconds, and then it passed behind a stand of cedars and was gone. I held the glass on that spot for a long time. A long time. Nothing moved. The cedars just stood there in the morning light, and the bench was empty, and the hollow was still silent. I told myself it was a hunter who had crossed onto my lease from the adjacent property. a big man in dark clothing, moving at an angle that had made his proportions seem wrong through the glass. I told myself the lighting had fooled my eye on the height. I told myself it was the most reasonable explanation, and I chose to hold it. I held it for about 4 hours. At some time around noon, I came down from the stand and ate lunch at camp with Roy. He had seen nothing from his position, which was up on the east ridge, and he seemed easy and normal, and I did not tell him about the track or the ridgeline movement. I said the morning had been quiet. He agreed that the rut activity seemed to have lulled, which was normal for a midday break, and we planned to be back in our stands by 2 in the afternoon. I was back at my stand by 1:15. The afternoon was still and cold, the temperature dropping as the overcast thickened, and around 2:30 I smelled it. I cannot give you a comparison that will do it justice. I have smelled things in the woods that I did not expect and could not immediately place. Decomposing deer, hog wallows, the musk of a male bear in October. This was not any of those. It was heavy and wet and had a quality to it that was partly animal and partly something else, something older and rawer, a smell that seemed to come up from the ground as much as from the air. It arrived on a slight shift in the wind, and when it hit me, I stopped moving entirely, not as a decision, but as a reflex, the way you go still when something registers before your mind has caught up to what it registered. The silence came back. All at once, the same pressed quality as the morning, the same total absence. The creek sound cut off, not gradually, not fading, cut off. Then I heard it on the creek bank below me. It was moving in the leaves along the creek bar, downstream from my position. And the footfall was not the footfall of a deer. It was too heavy, too spaced, and it had a rhythm I can only describe as deliberate, a 2-beat cadence with a specific interval that was not 4-footed. I was up in a climbing stand on a tulip poplar at the edge of the flat, maybe 20 feet off the ground, and I looked down through the branches trying to find it. The light under the canopy was poor, and the leaves on the ground had gone gray and flat in the overcast, and at first I could not separate anything from the background. Then it stepped into the open section of the creek bar, the same limestone flat where I had found the track that morning. I'm going to tell you what I saw, and I am going to tell it the way I saw it, which is in pieces, because that is how the mind works in that kind of moment, moving from one detail to the next and not finding a frame for the whole. It stood on 2 legs. It stood at a height that I can only estimate by reference to the tulip poplar it was near, a tree whose trunk I could gauge because I was in its crown, and based on that reference, it stood somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall. The body was heavy through the chest and the shoulders, built wide in the way that made the head look proportionally smaller than it should have, though the head was not small. The head was shaped wrong for a man, carried slightly forward of the shoulders rather than set square on top of them, and it held the ears high, set wide and pointed, like the ears of a dog, but much larger, moving independently in the way that a large predator's ears move when it is locating sound. The face, what I could see of it from 20 feet up and 60 feet of horizontal distance, was long and muzzled, not flat, a forward thrust face with a jaw that was too heavy and too deep to be human. The fur across the back and shoulders was the color of dark walnut bark, long enough in places to lie in matted cords, shorter along the spine and across the top of the head. The hands, if you can call them that, were held low and slightly away from the body, and the fingers were long and the knuckles were heavy, and I watched those hands open and close slowly, twice, in a motion that looked almost like something a person does when they are thinking. It was looking at the creek. It stood on the limestone bar and looked downstream for a moment. Then it raised its head and looked across the flat, and then, in a motion that was very slow and very deliberate, it turned and looked up. It looked up toward where I was. I have thought about that moment every day for more than 7 years. The eyes caught what light there was from the gray sky in a way that eyes do not catch light. Not the eyeshine of a deer caught in a headlamp. Something different, a dull amber that seemed to belong to whatever was behind the eyes, rather than to the light falling on them. It looked up at me. I do not know with certainty that it saw me. I know that it looked. I know that I did not breathe for however long it looked. Stay still. That is what I told myself. Do not move. Do not raise the rifle. Stay still and be small and give it nothing to decide about. The smell was very strong, and it stood there for what I believe was close to 4 minutes. And in those 4 minutes, I held myself against the tree with my back flat on the platform and my rifle across my chest. And I waited. At some point in that 4 minutes, it lowered its head and turned slightly, orienting its ears toward the ridge to the west, toward where Roy's stand was. It took one step back from the limestone bar, then another. Then Roy's rifle fired once, a single flat crack from up the ridge. Aimed at nothing, I understood later. Just fired into the air the way a man fires when he needs to make a loud sound, without knowing exactly what he is trying to scare. The echo rolled around the hollow and the creek bar was empty before the echo finished. I did not hear it run. That was what stayed with me in the minutes afterward. Something that large and that close should have made noise going through the leaves and the creek side brush. I did not hear it leave. The hollow was just empty, and the creek sound came back, and the chickadees came back into the branches above me, and the whole woods seemed to exhale at once. I climbed down from the stand. I was not moving quickly. I was not moving on adrenaline or panic. I moved the way you move when something has taken everything out of you and what is left is just mechanical function. I descended the tree, collected my gear from the base, and I walked out of that flat and up the ridge toward camp. When I came over the ridge, Roy was already there, standing by the truck with his rifle in his hands, and his face set in an expression I had never seen on him before. He looked at me, and I looked at him. "We should pack up," he said. That was all he said. I agreed, and we packed. I want to stop here for 1 second, because if you have ever seen something out there in the woods that you could not make fit into any reasonable category, I want to know about it. Leave a comment. It helps to know that other people have been in the same kind of moment and carried it home the same way. We loaded the truck in the last of the gray afternoon light and drove out on the gravel road without speaking. The hollow dropped away behind us on the left side of the road, and I watched it through the passenger window, the bare trees going dark against the sky, and I did not feel anything I could name clearly. I felt emptied out. Roy turned onto the highway and we drove north toward Carthage, and neither of us said a word until we passed through Gordonsville, and Roy pulled into the parking lot of Walt Briggs's gas station to get fuel. I got out and went inside for coffee. Walt was behind the counter, a heavy-set man in his 70s, with a gray crew cut and the slow, careful way of talking that old-timers in those small towns sometimes have. He was from that country, and his family had been from that country for generations. I did not plan to say anything. I was paying for my coffee, and he was making change. And I said, almost without deciding to say it, that we had had a strange night down in the hollow, and I wondered if he had ever heard of anything unusual in that bottomland along the Caney Fork tributary. Walt looked at me for a moment. He counted the change into my hand, and then he said, "A lot of hollow country down through there." That was it. His eyes did not widen. He did not ask a follow-up. He handed me my change and turned back toward the register. And there was something in the way he did not ask the follow-up that told me he understood what I was dancing around. He was not going to say it, and he was not going to confirm it, and he was going to let me carry it out the door the same way I had carried it in. I nodded and went back to the truck. Roy pulled back onto the highway, and we finished the drive to Smithville. And by the time he dropped me at my house, it was past 9 o'clock, and Peg had left the porch light on. Roy said goodnight and drove away, and I stood in the driveway for a minute before I went inside. I sold the lease in February 2018. I told the timber company representative that I was not going to be able to use it the following season and that I wanted to let it go. I gave no other reason. I lost the deposit I had put down for the following year, which was not a large amount of money, but it was real money and it stung. And I paid it without argument because I was not going to spend another night in that hollow country. Roy never mentioned that evening again, not once, in the years since. I have seen him at least a dozen times, at the feed store, at mutual friends' deer camps, at a funeral for a man we both knew from the county. We talked the same as we always did, about the weather and the deer season and how the turkey numbers have been running. He never brought it up, and I never pushed him, and what happened on that ridge when he fired his rifle is something he has decided to keep inside himself, and I respect that. Some men carry things that way. Cutter died in the spring of 2019, and a year and a half after that trip. I do not know what killed him. Roy said he just started failing in March, went off his feed, stopped responding the way he had always responded, and was gone by April. Roy did not say there was a connection to the hollow. I did not say it either. I only know that Cutter was a healthy dog before that trip, and was not a healthy dog afterward, and that what happened between those two facts is not something I can account for. I did not deer hunt in November of 2018 or 2019 or 2020. I told people I was busy, and for parts of those years I was, and for parts of those years, that was not the real reason. The real reason was that I could not put myself back into hardwood hollow country in the dark before first light without the specific weight of that morning coming back to me in a way that made it very hard to stay. I know what that sounds like. I am telling it straight. I went back out in the fall of 2021 on a different property 30 miles from the Caney Fork drainage. A friend's farm, open country, field edges, no timber hollow. The hunting was fine, and I sat out 3 full mornings and saw deer and felt mostly normal, and I was grateful for that. I have hunted several times since. I stay out of hollow country when I can. If you had asked me in October of 2017 whether I believed in anything like what I saw in that creek bottom, I would have told you plainly that I did not. I would have said I believed in the things I had seen evidence for, and that I did not find the evidence compelling for the other category. I was 44 years old, and I had spent 1,000 mornings in the woods, and I knew what was in those woods. I was wrong about the second part of that. Not about the first mornings in the woods. I still believe that. I just understand now that knowing the woods well is a different thing from knowing everything that is in them, and that the space between those two things is larger than I was prepared for. I have a 30-06 that I've owned since 2009. I bought it from a man in Cookville who was selling off his father's guns after his father passed, and it is a plain working rifle with a scope I put on it myself, and a walnut stock that has a long scratch along the right side from a fence crossing in 2014. I did not fire that rifle in November of 2017. Not once. I carried it into the hollow 2 mornings and sat with it across my lap, and I did not fire it. And I have thought about that more than seems reasonable. What I would have done if the 4 minutes had gone differently. Whether a 30-06 would have meant anything at all. The rifle stands in the corner of my basement, behind the water heater, where I put it when I got home from that trip. It is not moved from that spot. I clean it where it stands. I have taken it out of the house exactly once to have the action checked, and I brought it right back and put it in the same corner. I don't know what was in that hollow. I am not going to tell you what I think it was, because anything I say moves it from the category of what I saw into the category of what I believe. And those are different categories, and I am trying to stay in the first one. I saw what I have told you I saw. I heard what I have told you I heard. I found the track that I found. I am a 44-year-old pipe welder from Smithville who hunted that ground for 3 years and knows what belongs in a Middle Tennessee River hollow and knows what does not. One morning in that hollow, something did not belong. The rifle is still there in the corner.